Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jason Johnson. I'm the Associate Dean, Academic, and Head of the Architecture Program here at the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape. First of all, welcome everyone to the City Building Design Lab. You're here at a time that any of you who were in design school will remember as the sort of crunch time. We have about 10 days before some of our students will be presenting maybe for the last time before a non-budgeted project. And some of our other students will be presenting that sort of last project of their first year in the program. So if you get a chance afterwards and want to wander around the third floor, there's students kind of working madly to finish their projects for the end of term. But it's a great time to stop by a design school. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Calgary and in all its locations here within the city are located in the heart of southern Alberta. We acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7. These include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nations, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. I'm really excited for tonight's talk. Joining us tonight from ARUP is Melissa Burton. Melissa is the Operations Director for ARUP Canada and a principal in ARUP's Toronto office. She leads diverse project teams and supports clients in developing innovative, multidisciplinary solutions tailored to specific project sites and operational needs. Her technical work focuses on climate modeling and wind engineering applications. She brings not only the ability to conduct the climate risk assessments we all rely on, but more importantly, the understanding of how to develop resilience-based solutions. She also considers the financial and community impact that can result when climate change considerations are not made. Melissa is a fellow of wind engineering at ARUP and leads their Global Wind Skills Network. Through her work in the field of wind engineering and complex airflow modeling, she has had the opportunity to work and collaborate on some of the world's most iconic infrastructure across the UK, Asia, and North America. Tonight's lecture will focus on the subject of value-driven design. In this presentation, Melissa is going to touch on values and beliefs that could be proposed to underpin our approach to design. So if you could please join me in welcoming Melissa.
Thank you. Okay, so tonight I am going to give a provocation into the room, maybe some multiple times of a provocation. First off, though, I wanted to just talk a little bit about, what is value and values-driven design. I'm going to move my lapel mic just down a bit. So if you go to the Oxford Dictionary, the word value is expressed as a regard that something is held to deserve, its importance, worth, or usefulness. And the verb to value is to consider someone or something to be important or beneficial, or to estimate the monetary worth of something. So that is literally how we define value when you go to the Oxford Dictionary. So my opinion really is that value is more of a subjective context than this. Are you getting a lot of echo from the mic? Should I move it down further, or is it good? Okay, fantastic. Is that value is much more of a subjective context. So people often associate this value with monetary terms, but actually, in reality, that is not value, that is cost, which is a fixed idea, something that's set by the market and that is the same for all of us. And I just want to give you a little example. So you and I both go to the store, we buy a loaf of bread, we pay $5 for that loaf of bread. I eat sandwiches every day for lunch. You eat salads every day for lunch. the value that I have for that loaf of bread is very different because of the contextual relationship that I have with bread compared to that value that you, or the value that you have with bread. And because value is subjective, we often need to make our conversation about value much more dynamic and about and much more intersectional than this single point like cost in order for the conversation to be useful. So I'm hoping to take you through a little storyline here that's going to talk a little bit about what I believe are 8 core underpinning concepts that relate to the way that we can really express value in design. So what is value-driven design? And I think that the answer lies in an exploration of the complex nature of the built environment. And I'm going to walk through, one by one, a storyline that is going to take us through inclusion, through to fairness, through to responsibility, into sustainability, to resilience, and then into some maybe slightly more complex context of value, which is in solidarity, dynamism, and humility. So this is in the background of the graph here. We're going to start with inclusion. And in the background of the graph here, you can see the number of female engineering students that graduated from my university. I graduated from the University of Waterloo back in 2000. And I'm going to focus on a story of gender inclusion here to illustrate how inclusion is generally important. And there's lots of other aspects, of course, to inclusion that are equally relevant, but we're going to focus on gender, and I'm going to walk you through a storyline here. So despite the fact that women earn more than 40% of MBAs, 59% of college-educated graduates, and an entry-level workforce, and hold 52% of professional-level jobs, we only make up 15% of executive officer roles, and we only represent 4.6% of Fortune 500 CEOs. So based on this current rate of leadership progression in our AEC industry, so this is in our industry, it will be 2085, it's long before I end my career, before women reach parity with men in position of leadership. And I ask the question, when we don't have appropriate representation around the table, that of course impacts the way that we design and oftentimes the decisions that we make in the decision process. So science suggests that stereotypes that feed biases around gender start around the age of 19 months. I can attest to this because I remember reading a book to my daughter when she was the age of 5. Daughter, who is educated in my household, had only had 1 year of kindergarten education at the time. And we were reading a book about a doctor, and the doctor in the book happened to be a woman. And my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, she asked me, well, Mommy, how is that possible? Because women can't be doctors. And we are surrounded by these gender stereotypes that feed biases in every part of our life. Toy marketing today is more gender biased than what it was 50 years ago. So since COVID, we've seen a rapid decline in the number of women who are seeking professional registration in our AEC industry, and we've seen women leaving the industry at a rate much higher than their male counterparts. So I think it's important to note that gender binaries impact women and men alike, because for every woman who can't get up the corporate ladder, there's a man silently suffering as he's expected to man up to do his job. So this isn't just about the gender bias towards women. So, I asked us the question, how does this negatively impact the opportunities we have for reaching equality? And how might equality force us to design more inclusive and value-based spaces that work for all? And I promise it gets less political as I get further into the talk. So this is a project that was designed by Gell Studios. It's the Basin 7 waterfront. Gell Studios is known world over for designing some of our most inclusive urban spaces. They have a near 50% gender balance in leadership, and that has been a key target and a focus of theirs for decades, if not more. So in 1974, there was a book that was written called The Production of Space, and in that book, it argues that space is a complex social construct based on people's values, and that physical space representation is linked to one's imagination and one's identity. There was a number of years later that there was another textbook that was published that discusses this idea of third space. And that is defined as a real and imagined space, a lived space. And it suggests that space design should not be approached in a single binary way, but in somewhere in between material and mental space, both being real and imagined. And it's argued that the social and individual perception of space is closely related to the injustices and inequalities that space produce. So my personal provocation here to all of us in the room would be, without this inclusion and representation at design leadership senior levels, how could we possibly design real and imagined spaces that are as inclusive and representative as we need them to be for long-term societal relevance? And it was in 2019 when the city of Barcelona put forward the urban planning with a gender perspective guideline. And this lays out a set of measurements on how to integrate a gender perspective into urban planning policy in order to achieve a fairer, more equal, safer city without barriers. And the plan has 4 strategic objectives: increasing institutional gender expertise via gender training or gender budgeting. That's number 1. Number 2 is promoting gender equality in employment and entrepreneurial support programs. Number 3 is addressing structural barriers that infringe upon human and societal rights in the city. And number 4 is ensuring that public space is safe and inclusive for women and girls, emphasizing the need to address gender-based violence. So this is one of the only public space inclusivity frameworks produced by local government globally. So why should we care? Why do we think inclusion is a fundamental key component to design, and why do we need to actually do better and make change? Well, because it is shown that inclusive companies are 1.7 times more likely to be innovation leaders. It provides improved user experience for all of the spaces that we want to interact with. And in addition to that, it creates positive reputation. So spaces are known for their inclusive environments, gain positive reputation, and therefore, attract a greater number of people to the utilization of that space. I'm going to move on to my second topic now, and I'm going to talk a little bit about fairness. So it was in the late 2000s when many of us here suffered our first big career and management challenge, and that is now become known as the Great Recession. And since this period, and commencing before, there's evidence suggesting that we moved from a market economy to what is called a market society, where our values became much more narrowed to market fundamentalism, and this contributes to the growing exclusivity of capitalism and the rise of populism that we're seeing around the globe today. So many would argue that this is undermining our basic social construct of relative equality of outcomes and fairness across generations. So by equating this idea of price with value, it results in this flattening of our values. Too often we see that decisions are made by summing up prices with no sense of priority or consideration for the distribution or the relative merit. And there are things that we cannot price. We just simply cannot, like nature, community, diversity, and the future health of our planet. So this results fundamentally in us making trade-offs against our values, i.e. growth today for crisis tomorrow. So how do we push back against this, and how do we interweave our values back into the market economy and really push on this idea of fairness? So we at ARUP, we've recently worked with a South African NGO to publish a framework for fire safety in informal settlements. And this is setting a stage for how we can transfer fire design knowledge to these communities. So a fire in an informal settlement can affect thousands of people, and recovery is long and difficult. It's often exacerbated because of financial instability and a lack of insurance, where those are the norm. So, I believe that a values-driven design approach, asks us to continue to find these opportunities of taking what we know today and moving this to other places where we can provide the value of our learnings in what I'd like to call our Robin Hood type of work. So why should we care? Why should we care that fairness becomes part or a value in which we measure our success of design? Because it enhances community trust. And as designers, we have an ethical responsibility to create spaces that do not discriminate or exclude. And fair designs often lead to much more functional and user-friendly spaces, and it drives positive social impact. So moving on to responsibility. So responsibility means feeling accountable for our actions and understanding the temporal value or the temporal reality of value. Value is specific to both time and situation, and we often interpret value for the future based of our understanding for value today. But sometimes, and I think we're learning this more and more, value can be predicted on today's understanding, but oftentimes it cannot. And I give you a very clear example of COVID in 2020 when it hit. We as designers could have never, that's probably an erroneous statement. We didn't forecast the future maybe in a way that we potentially could have. And it was in 2020 when the World Health Organization wrote that the economic and social disruption caused by the pandemic is devastating. Nearly half of the world's 3.3 billion global workforce are at risk of losing their livelihoods. Informal economy workers are particularly vulnerable because the majority lack social protection and access to quality health care. So I would say that never in certainly my career had I been faced with a greater challenge than this. And I think that this was maybe one of the very first instances where I got knocked out of my comfort zone and really forced to reconsider this, portions of what I had defined as value. So at the time, we at ARUP were working on the Jewel Changi Airport, and we were working with Safety Architects. And the design, it's a very exciting design. It weaves together the experience of being in nature with everything that you would come to expect at a large international airport. But then of course COVID hit, and nobody's traveling anymore. Air travel is down. We've now got this this massive airport that we are working on the design of, with no knowledge as to whether air traffic and air travel was ever going to come back to pre-pandemic levels. So it forced us to really reconsider that moment in time and some of the thinking that we had originally brought forward into the design. So in addition, overnight we saw all of our office towers become vacant. I live in Toronto, and over 1/3, it's estimated, will still sit vacant until the 2040s. And that you then look at the flip side of what I call a crisis that we're currently having in Toronto, where residential vacancies are sub 1%. So the not-for-profit Toronto Foundation is reporting that shelters are overflowing, evictions are rising, and wait lists for affordable housing are growing at unsustainable rates. And so, my provocation to the room would really be that, designers, we should have a responsibility to almost anticipate, that value can change over time and try to future-proof for our projects by leaning into the broader definition of societal value. So I think, had we forecasted or had we considered this concept of value being temporal, and in general, our responsibility to that consideration, I think we probably would have reconsidered maybe some of the ways in which we were designing offices, considering them to be potentially more adaptable for a future landscape where they were going to need to have an identity of being something else. And so we at ARUP have just completed a study, Office to Residential Conversions, the Carbon Story, and it shows that expanding eligibility for this office to residential conversion, it could result in a 54% reduction in whole life cycle carbon emissions by 2020. So, we have an opportunity here that's sitting in front of us to, understanding kind of where we have positioned the build out of the cities to really rethink now, how are we going to position these assets for, the future landscape of what we need them to be. So, why should we care? Why should we care about responsibility? Why why is responsibility important for us as designers, and for us to be thinking about this idea of it being a value consideration in how we design. Well, I would suggest that when we bring this thinking of responsibility into our consideration, it ensures long-term viability of the projects in which we're engaging. It means engaging with the community to understand needs and preferences, and it also encourages us to consider the adaptability and the future landscape in which the projects that we are working on are going to need to respond. So I'm going to move on to sustainability now, and this is an image of some mega flooding that happened in Italy probably about 8 months ago now, and I am not sure how many people are tracking temperatures in the North Atlantic Basin. I do track temperatures in the North Atlantic Basin because I think it's somewhat telling for the trajectory of our future. So if you take a look in the graph I've got plotted up there, all of the blue lines represent the sea surface temperatures fluctuating month over month through a yearly period. And it is from 1982 through to 2022. And you can see kind of there's a mean line that's drawn through that, and it's a normal distribution. Like all the behaviors are kind of moving up and down around this mean line, and within like normal standard deviations around the mean. And then in 2023, something really funky happened. So we started out in the early parts of the year with something that maybe represents the history of what's been happening for the last 50 years. But then midway through 2023, you're seeing now sea surface temperatures that are about 5 standard deviations from the mean. And so climate scientists will tell us that we are in a new climate paradigm now. 2024 has not returned to any of the last 50-year levels. And this kind of really means that we can't use the history to predict the future anymore. So the past can't tell us a story of the behavior of the climate and what it's going to mean for all of the places in which we live and work and build and design in the future. And so I've got a quote from a book called Values, and it tells us that climate change is the ultimate betrayal of intergenerational equity. So as it imposes cost on future generation that the current generation has zero direct incentive to fix. And so, I think we're going to talk a little bit about sustainability and how we can really think about, fixing this conundrum. So how do we address the climate crisis? It's going to be a test of our values. Climate change is an issue that it involves the entire world. No one can self-isolate. It's predicted by science to be the central risk to tomorrow, and it can really only be addressed if we act in advance and we lean in. So this is from the World Wildlife Foundation, and they will tell us that climate change poses a fundamental threat to places, species, and people's livelihoods. From the polar bears in the Arctic to marine turtles off the coast of Africa, our planet's diversity of life is at risk from the changing climate. 1.5 degrees Celsius is safer than 2 degrees for both people and nature. And we already know that higher global temperatures lead to greater climate impacts on land, in the ocean, in the polar regions. And the World Wildlife Foundation will tell us that net zero emissions are needed. It is better to not pollute in the first place, so rapid and deep cuts are a priority, and actively removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to balance out the hard-to-mitigate residual emissions needs to become a priority. So the current, it's now saying that plus 2 degrees is maybe no longer achievable for us, but we are already seeing plus 1.5 degrees in global warming. It's having widespread impacts across and beyond expectation. And I've got a couple of slides here that just kind of talk a little bit about the cost of the Hurricane Sandy disaster. I was living in New York when Hurricane Sandy struck, and huge swaths of the land. This is Superstorm Sandy was not one of the most intense from the cyclonic wind speeds, but one of the largest in its diameter and the impact that it had. So, very large swath of land impacted by it. And the Rockaways, which is an area in Long Island, just outside of the Brooklyn area, they tend to be underinsured through that area, so you can't actually get flooding insurance if you own a house there. And the storm surge was so great that mud walls basically came in and took down some of these houses and flooded out the basements. And the long-term impact of that and the displacement of the communities is the impact that we don't assess when we're just looking at the numbers of the against kind of the cost of the climate, the hurricane in this instance. So the Ninth Ward in New Orleans is still not reoccupied. So it was one of the more poorer areas of New Orleans. It was completely devastated in Hurricane Katrina and displaced 100% of the population. Less than 30% of the population has returned to the Ninth Ward. And so this is a community that had vibrancy to it and a connectivity that drove kind of the cultural underpinning to the city that we know of New Orleans. And after this very impactful event, it's displaced and never to come back. So the scale and intensity of loss and damage is increasing, both from an economic perspective, but also from a migration perspective. And both practically and morally, we can no longer sit on the sidelines and treat human and planetary issues as someone else's problem. So we as designers, I think we have an active role in solving our biggest shared challenge for the future. This is Bosco Verticale by Stefano Boeri in Milan. I don't know how many people know this project, but it was one of the very first tower projects that was developed with this this truly integrated green facade. And so greening our cities was one of the most effective and practical, realistic ways of reversing the increasing urban heat island effect that we're seeing in all of our cities globe over. So bringing nature to just one side of the building, so a fifth of the surface area can gain immediate effect or immediate benefit. A lot of our contemporary buildings, they've got this metal and glass facade, and they tend to absorb quite a lot of heat through the solar energy that imparts on its cities during the day. And then that heat gets rejected at night into the cities. We're increasing our cooling demand in the summer times. And by greening up the facades, you have this real potential to change the urban heat island effect that we're seeing. And not only do you get this benefit of supported cooling, but the plants, the substrate of the plants also absorbs noise. It cleans air, so you get a better air quality in the building and around in the neighborhood. And the green envelopes also reduce the effect of stronger rainfall, so it means a reduced occurrence of city flooding. So there's lots of opportunity for us to challenge and kind of push and improve our design. So why should we care? Why should we care about sustainability? Well, it's about environmental protection. It's about health and well-being. It's about the economic benefits that we can see when we do care about this. And it's also about the social equity. And that is intergenerational social equity that I'm talking about and referring to there. So moving on to resilience, this is the City Resilience Index. This was developed by ARUP in support of the Rockefeller Foundation, and it's based on 5 years of research and testing. It incorporates a framework that's used more than 100 cities to guide them in their resilience journey. And whatever the specific threats that a city faces, the City Resilience Index can motivate the city to become future focused. And ultimately, resilience is about much more than just managing risk to reduce loss, which is sometimes what we kind of define it to be. It's about understanding and taking action for what matters most to unlock value and succeed, but both today, tomorrow, and then ultimately into the future. And to support this, the post-disaster speed of recovery, ARUP has built out what we call the Ready suite of guidelines, and it focuses on this continued functionality in addition to life safety. So it's thinking through this enhanced design, it's thinking through contingency planning, It's thinking through community engagement, and then also, design solutions that can be brought to the projects in which you are engaging in order to, weather or resist or, most importantly, recover from the event. So all of these guidelines mostly deal with natural disasters. Some of the elements of community planning and business continuity can prevail for man-made disasters in a near similar way. So, I would say that, here in Canada, we are seeing unprecedented urban growth, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But urban growth is not really just a Canada-only challenge. In Africa, immigration into cities is going to be rapid for the next 30 years. So some cities are going to double in size by 2050. And across Africa, much of the required infrastructure and built environment, it doesn't yet exist. So it presents a massive opportunity for us as designers, so we can rethink how we determine the value of development. And I would say, given the errors and woes of some of our other failed global cities, or some of our other challenged global cities. And we at ARUP have recently developed a set of guiding principles. It's called Better for the First Time. And there's 4 key principles to that. First and foremost, be a good custodian of nature. Second, listen to and learn from client science. And then third is prioritizing water security. And then fourth is being sensitive to the community impacts that you're going to have. So I want to talk a little bit about water scarcity, because this is being Canadians. I think we don't necessarily have historically thought about this being like an our problem, but only 0.5% of the water on Earth is usable and available as fresh water, and climate change is dangerously affecting that supply. So water and climate change are, they're inextricably linked, and extreme weather events are making water more scarce, more unpredictable, more polluted, or all three. So roughly half of the world's population is experiencing severe water scarcity for at least part of the year. And these numbers are expected to increase. So, I would suggest that, we here in Canada, we can no longer be assured that our waters are going to be abundant, safe, and secure. And, we have time to act, and that time is now. So science is telling us that the rate at which water moves through the water cycle is accelerating, and that's fundamentally changing our water and precipitation patterns. And evidence of such change here in Canada is mounting, where we're seeing, many more frequent extreme floods. We're seeing droughts in certain parts of our country, and much more prolific wildfires that are running through our cities. So, I would challenge us all to think through this idea of water and really put it at the center of our consideration for design. So we really have this opportunity to think through the water cycle and address today and tomorrow's challenge by integrating water circularity, this idea of circular green infrastructure and circular solutions using nature-based design. So this is a project that we've just recently been working on in North Toronto. It's the Downsview development, and many of the ideas. So we've set up the Master Environmental Servicing Plan, and many of the ideas that we've brought to the table here are really about this idea of water circularity. So how do you look to stormwater manage? How are you integrating green infrastructure? And this is a future city of 100,000 people that. We have a long-term investment holder for the project, is really thinking about this temporal consideration of value and how you build in resilient solutions into the design. The resilient design, it incorporates features that help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change, but it also creates social cohesion and I would suggest economic stability. Okay, so the 3 more complicated ones now we're gonna talk about. And first we're gonna talk a little bit about solidarity. So according to the United Nations, an average of 22 million people are displaced each year by weather-related and/or geopolitical events. And this number is expected to rise to approximately 1.2 billion people by 2050. Despite the fact that the Canadian government, we don't explicitly recognize climate refugees, it's estimated that tens of thousands of people immigrate to Canada each year from areas that are significantly impacted by climate change. Toronto's population has been increasing by approximately 10% year over year for the last 5 years or more. And this is kind of unprecedented growth that is really only seen in the city landscape when you rewind and you go back and you look to China in like the late 2000s and early 2010s, when we had a massive rural migration into the urban centers. And it was there that that rise of about 10% year over year was last seen. So, this I think creates a recognition of our obligations to each other. We have these city environments that are, becoming more strained and stressed because of our population increase, and it's important for us to, both welcome with open arms, but in addition to that, think about this shared sense of community opportunity that this population increase is creating for us, and to think through what that means for us as a design opportunity. So these are some images from a June 2023 ARUP report called Tall Buildings, Rising to the Net Zero Challenge. I have a background specializing in tall buildings, and I believe fundamentally that the densification of our cities is important for us because it creates this opportunity to better serve the populations that we need to serve. But every project and site are different, and in this report, what we do is we walk through the sequential journey of a mid to tall building and what you would need to go through if you wanted to achieve, net zero or, even beyond outcomes, potentially net positive. So as our cities are really growing at these unprecedented rates, and understanding this urban densification is critical, and we have an opportunity, here in this room to challenge each other and to push the design envelope to, demand that we are doing more with what we are designing. So solidarity, it creates a collective empowerment, it strengthens the resilience of the communities, and it drives social change. The dynamism. So nearly 70% of the world's population is going to live in cities by the year 2030, 70%. The quality of life experienced by this population is going to determine our future. So it's increasingly that cities have the power to tackle climate change, prosperity, and alleviate poverty. With the advent of social media and the growth of the global middle class, urban citizens have greater power than ever to stop or start projects, choose where they live, work and invest, and demand a better quality of life. So, I would suggest as a provocation that I think here in Canada, we're undergoing a revolution. We're becoming a much more connected global nation, and we have the opportunity and the power on an individual level to demand more from the homes that we buy, the public parks we explore, and the transit systems that we use to commute. And we shouldn't be shy, to stand up and, change the world. Saw that sign when I came in, and I absolutely thought, I was like, yeah, that's a great sign. It's exactly what we all need to do more of. So, I think in parallel, we're seeing this rise of digital and AI. We're observing this technology revolution where machine learning and satellite data are being used in significant ways. They're being used to optimize energy use in buildings, to reduce congestion, to improve public transportation efficiency, predicting waste generation patterns, and optimizing collection routes. And so, I think that there's somewhat of a reluctance, or I don't want to call it a negativity, but a reluctance and blocking this widespread deployment of AI and advanced technologies into the built environment sector. But I would almost suggest that we need to embrace and we need to engage in a different way, because it presents a massive opportunity for us as designers. So at ARUP, we're currently working in the UK with the government to use machine learning and satellite data to forecast areas across the country that have probable risk for flooding, and then to support the prevention of flooding, understanding what this probable risk is. So beyond AI, there's this push and this move that I think we should all be making to net positive and regenerative design practices. And net positive is about giving more than what you take. The planetary boundaries become important for consideration. It's not just repackaged corporate responsibility. Greenwash can be very difficult when you're pushing not just net zero, but beyond into the net positive domain. Fossil fuels and gambling are out, and profit isn't the measure of success. And I show this graph quite often when I'm talking to university students, because what I say is this is the gigatons of CO2 that is in the environment. And you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, as we all know, there's more and more that's going into the environment. We're on this like accelerated exponential curve, and I call this our moment of choice, because that's what we have right now. As designers in the room, we have a choice, and we have a choice as to whether we're not going to make any change. We're just going to accelerate along the path of exponential growth, and that is a choice. Or we have this opportunity to kind of show maybe just holding our emissions where they are, and what that means is probably net zero in some places. Other parts of the globe are undergoing their own industrial revolution, and we have global bargaining and global exchange of trade. Or we move the world in a different trajectory, which is net positive. And the area under the curve is not my career anymore. I'll retire before there, but the area under the curve is the opportunity, really, that somebody who's just starting out in their career has. And so it's a choice that we can collectively make. So I would say that dynamism, what it asks us to be, is more adaptable and to lean into change, to accept ideas that maybe we become or we have historically been a little bit uncomfortable with, and really challenge and push the envelope of design. And it requests engagement, it requests interaction, and it encourages us to really think through advanced technologies and sustainable practices, and how we can better integrate those into design. Okay, finally, humility. So humility requires a willingness to listen and to learn from others. This is the Thursday Island Chronic Disease Hospital in Queensland in Australia. This building was designed to be identifiable by the local Indigenous communities by embracing aspects of the lifestyle and cultural sensitivities. The color palette itself reflects the waters and island sands of the Torres Strait, which are integral to the Indigenous way of life. And by recognizing the need for cultural specific issues to be addressed in the design, it ensures that facilities like this will be successfully utilized. So had that engagement and that humility of approach in the design function not been taken in this project, the people that we were designing it for would have never used it. And so there has to be this integration and this humbleness or this humility that we approach design with. And it was through extensive, meaningful consultation with the Indigenous communities who this building is for, was seen as fundamental to the success, certainly of this project. And I have examples of projects here across Canada as well. So this idea of designing for diverse communities and thinking through accessibility and inclusion and being human-centered and future-focused, from wayfinding to lighting to layout of operations, there's different requirements that our diverse societies and need. And unless we listen, we cannot learn. So accessible inclusive design, it also considers how personal circumstance or identity, including age, culture, disability, gender identity, and family or economic status might change over the lifetime of a building or a space. And bringing this value perspective into the design thinking ultimately results, I would suggest, in a better design outcome. Okay, so why should we care? Why should we care about humility and integrating this idea of humility as a value measure in our design? So it helps us create designs that are not only functional and beautiful, but also deeply connected to the people they serve, and allows us to accept feedback to foster empathy and to build trust. Okay, so I'm gonna round it out now because hopefully I've taken you on a little journey where I've maybe convinced you at least a number of the components at which we can really think about this measure of value and how we assess our designs. So some of the 8 elements that I discussed are more tangible, like sustainability, resilience, and inclusion. While I think others are slightly more abstract, like humility or fairness. But taken together, I think that these 8 areas of focus represent a strong starting point for engaging in much more holistic and comprehensive value-driven design. So, ultimately, why value-driven design? Well, I think hopefully I've convinced you that values-driven design, it focuses on creating lasting positive impact for community and the environment. And it's an approach that ensures that designs contribute to the well-being of society and to the planet, rather than just serving our immediate needs. And it leads to much more ethical, impactful, and user-centered outcomes that address the emotional and practical need of users, making spaces more enjoyable and ultimately more functional, and ultimately more of places where all of us in the room want to engage and interact and play for the next number of years of our life. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Melissa. I think we have time for a couple questions. So I will just raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll transfer the mic to you.
Thanks for the talk, Melissa. I was just wondering about if you could provide an example of how we can demand more from, we were talking about housing, and in such an increasingly competitive space, it seems like, people are fighting for any house they can get and will take anything. But what's an example of how we could potentially demand more in that space and create better outcomes?
Yeah, so I was having this conversation actually earlier today. So I moved back to Toronto. I'm originally from Toronto, but I lived outside of Toronto for 20 years, and I moved back to Toronto 5 years ago. And I feel like Canada is in a place of change. And in the last number of years, created this housing scarcity. It is, has rapidly increased the value of the houses that we are buying. And, as that value actually increases, or as that kind of cost increases, and the dollar value that we are putting against it actually increases, then, you have an opportunity to kind of be more discerning. And I think we are becoming more discerning about where we put it. Am I going to buy a condo where I know the facade leaks and, I know that there's maybe been some panels that have fallen out over the last number of years? Or am I going to go with that long-term developer who I know, has created this amazing public space at ground level that I can integrate with and I can utilize, and is actually going to have a longevity to the asset that I can trust. And so I think that as kind of the cost goes up, then we become a lot more careful about how we make selections and how we think about that enduring cost over time. So I would say that New York has seen this for a very long time. The cost per square foot in New York is like atrocious. And what that means is that if you are developing something that doesn't necessarily land in the market, people will buy it. That development
Did we have another question? Oh,
Thank you for the presentation. I was really inspired. I want to come back with the early statement that you made about inequality in the profession of engineer between women and men. And I was wondering, in your company, is there any like supportive incentive that you put in place to yourself, like tackle that inequity?
Interesting. So I think there's an interesting changing landscape. There's I so I just have to be a little bit careful with my words. Um, you know, there's, there's kind of pushes that are coming, and
in the context of the sort of infrastructure of developing cities, where a lot of the urban growth is less managed and more dependent on sort of localized understanding of, people are building their own homes and communities. In the context of talking about being humble about what designers and engineers might bring to that context, how do you see this idea of, let's say, you described it as Robin Hood knowledge transfer, being instrumentalized in that type of situation?
out of San Francisco, and we particularly focus on we do a lot of work with FEMA, a lot of work with the World Bank, and it is really about this.
Thank you so much for the presentation. As ARUP works internationally, I'm curious to hear a little bit about how does ARUP navigate partnerships and policy frameworks when working on major projects? In this case, partnerships with communities.
Navigate.
Okay, thank you. I think we're at time. And I want to thank you again, Melissa. So if you could join me in thanking us for the talk tonight. Just two announcements. One is for people who are interested. We have sort of open juries next week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, if people are interested in seeing some of the work that students are doing. And then, of course, the year-end show, which is our year-end party, is open to the public, and anyone who wants to come and see the work of all of our students from undergrad to graduate, that'll be happening, I believe, a week from this next Friday. But just if you follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, you'll see the invitation for that. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good evening.